Helping you make the most of your retirement. This is the Retirement Years Podcast. Here are your hosts, Mary Ellen French and Dave Wing.
Hi there, I'm Mary Ellen.
And I'm Dave. Last week, we spoke with two retirees who wound up returning to the world of work in part-time retail jobs, which neither of them had any experience prior to retirement. In today's episode, Mary Ellen and I speak with two retirees from two very different jobs who love their work so much. Once they retired, they wound up returning to those jobs part-time.
And again, this is something that I connect to because I retired from a job that I loved, being a principal in a school. And after a brief period of time away from that, I was happy to return as an acting principal and just fill in occasionally when a principal needed to be away for a day or two or even up to a week. And I love doing that. It's a job I know well. I'm confident that I can do it well, and I know I can help others, and that is really important to me. So we're going to talk to a couple of guests, but before we do that, I want to share with listeners a research paper that we found on the effects of retirement on older adults' health. Quite interesting.
Yeah, and I'm glad you found this because we talked in season 1 about if is retirement good, is retirement bad? And of course, overwhelmingly, I think we all believe it's pretty darn good.
Oh, yeah.
But how does it impact your health? And it's nice to have some research behind that to at least give an informed opinion that will not apply to everyone, but will create some general advice. The discussion paper you're talking about, entitled Work Longer, Live Healthier, was written by a UK researcher who looked at research from around the world that explores the relationship between working longer and good health. And it attempts to answer the age-old question, is working longer better for your overall health or worse?
So it turns out that, of course, there's no easy answer to this.
Yeah.
In the short term, most of us experience what the author calls a holiday effect when we first retire. Our stress levels lower for most of us, depending on the job that we did. But if we held like a high stress job before retiring, definitely we experience that holiday effect. So initially, retirement has a positive impact on our health.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. And then in the longer term, it does appear that retirement for a lot of people, or at least some people, has a negative effect on their health as they move less than they did when they were working. Now, of course, again, that depends on the type of job they did prior to retirement. But even office workers, for example, they could run the risk of staying sedentary unless they make that conscious effort to say, I got to get up and move, because they would now have the time. But, if you get into the routine of being, as you say, chained to a desk, that's kind of hard to break out of as well. And that connects back to someone that we all remember, our friend Louise, who is now from the Dominican, with advice she shared with us back in season 2. That was episode 4 for anyone who wants to reel back and listen to that. And remember, you can catch previous episodes, seasons, etc., on our website, or of course, wherever you listen to podcasts. So the other advice we'd give is be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast provider so you don't miss an episode. You'll get a notification when a new one's available.
Exactly. Yeah. Another guest I remember too from season 4, Kimberly.
Yep.
She also mentioned, because she has an office job, and so she makes a conscious effort even while she's working to make sure that she's extra active. And so, that's an example of someone who has an office job and certainly will continue to be very active. In fact, more active when she retires.
For sure.
So the other negative impact on our health that happens for many people in retirement is a decline in our mental well-being, because our social interactions can decrease. And the reason for that, for many people, not everyone, but for many people, the majority of our social interactions happen at work with our coworkers, right? Depending on our jobs. Yeah. So the other piece of that is that as we age, we don't tend to leave our homes as often, right? We're not heading out every day to go to work. So we interact with others less and less, which again, we've had previous guests from the health field tell us that's a vital component for our overall health. And you're going to hear one of today's guests mention that as well.
Now, Mary Ellen, I don't want to be oppositional, but some of the folks I interacted with, it was quite good for my mental health. Stop that interaction, but we won't name names.
Nope.
I will later.
Okay.
But not now.
Okay.
And speaking of our guests, let's meet our first one, Mark Collins. He explains what he did for a living before retiring and still does now.
We're very, very grateful that you took time out of your semi-retired life. Would that be fair to say?
Semi-retired is that definitely fits, and I'm very glad to be here.
So let's start with telling our listeners what you used to do for a living before you retired, when you were working full-time.
Okay, when I was working full-time, I started rather late in my career for the career. I'm a police officer, and I started when I was 31, which is a little bit later in life than most, but I had to go through laser surgery and that type of thing to get to where I wanted to be. So I was a police officer for the Ontario Provincial Police for 29 years full-time. And the reason it was 29 years is that means that I hit 60, which allowed me to retire with a full pension, which comes down to planning for retirement, really. I was looking ahead. It's what I knew I wanted to do. For the last 19 years, as a full-time police officer, I was a sergeant. So I was in management. And it's not something that I really strived to do, and it wasn't something that I really wanted to do. It kind of fell into my lap fairly early in my career. And when I retired, and when I looked ahead to retiring, I decided what I wanted to do is I wanted to go back to what I joined the job for initially. So as soon as I could, I retired. I retired on my birthday when I turned 60. And I went back almost immediately as a constable, as a part-time constable, frontline officer. And the reason that I did that is because, as I said, that's what I always wanted to do in policing. I wanted to be on the front lines. I wanted to make a difference as much as I could. And retiring allowed me to get back to that, much like, perhaps in your case, Mary Ellen, going from being a principal back to being a part-time teacher. It got you back in the classroom, or it would get you back in the classroom. In this case, this got me back on the street. And it wasn't something I did to get back to the easier jobs like serving subpoenas or doing that type of thing. I jumped right back onto the front line doing traffic and backing up the younger frontline officers on some of the more difficult calls. And it's been an absolute joy to get back to doing what I'm doing. So I work 2 days a week. The schedule rotates depending on the needs of the force itself, of the OPP. And I love every second of what I'm doing.
So that's Mark. Now let's meet our second guest, Jean Perry. Tell our listeners what you did for a living when you worked full-time before retirement, and then you can transition into telling them what you do now.
Okay. Well, way back when I went to university, social work, psychology minor, and then I started right off the bat working with persistent mental illness in the community, people that lived in group homes. And from there that was in Wisconsin, moved to Colorado, got into mental health there, worked for some 25 years with the mental health system, and initially started out in the group homes and then moved into seniors and keeping them in the community, home and community-based services, and then went into nursing homes and assessments for clients going into nursing homes. And then I moved to Canada 20 years ago, and I've been here since, and here is community support services. So we provide like Meals on Wheels, home help, someone to help with cleaning of the house, someone to provide respite care for caregivers, and work with the people that are living in their homes that need some help. There's medical transportation. So we have volunteers that take people to medical appointments. We have quite a variety. During COVID, we changed up services so that we were providing a lot more video services. That was a challenge. We also did a COVID food program where we actually bought bags of groceries, and then we used our frozen meals on wheels. We were providing milk, soap, toothpaste, bread, all kinds of canned goods, and the frozen meals to people for $10. It was like $150, $200 worth of food. That was a big success. We then lost the funding for that, so that has stopped, but we were able to provide that program for about 2.5 years. So now we're just doing the regular Meals on Wheels.
Yeah.
And so that's my background. I did finally then retire. Part of it was due to COVID related stuff, and but I took 7 months off. And then I had the opportunity to come back to the same job, reduced hours. So I had been the 37.5 or 5 days per week full time, and I came back to 4 days per week. But basically the same job. And I just really missed being part of the community. Didn't realize when I left that I was going to have that was going to impact me so much. I really thought, well, and I know I could get a volunteer job doing something, but my job that I have here has such variety to it, such variety with working with people in the community for new programs, new ways of supporting seniors to live in their homes longer and safely. Yeah, so I decided this was my best option to come back to. It never hurts getting paid or having insurance either. And I really feel too that I have a lot to contribute because I've been in this field for so long that I really know the ins and outs of a very complex system. And so oftentimes when I first talk to someone, they are just starting in the system, trying to figure it out. And I am able to help people to navigate that system pretty seamlessly.
So we just heard from two retirees with two very different careers. One, a police officer who was helping to keep the streets and people safe, and the other who worked in senior care, helping to keep older adults safely in their homes as long as possible. And it's very clear from what we heard that both Mark and Jean loved what they did full time.
Yes.
And Mark planned ahead. He is a planner. There's no question of that. And I feel a kinship with Mark, and he planned ahead to return to work as a constable part-time immediately following his retirement date. Like Jules and Ed from our last episode planned ahead and did the same sort of thing. Where they end one job on a Friday and check in Monday morning with a different hat on, which in this case, very similar hat. Jean missed what she did, missed being part of that community. So after 7 months of retirement, because she did return, but not quite as quickly, but she returned to basically her previous job, but with reduced hours.
Yeah.
And I understand that. I think when you love your job, especially in the healthcare field, I would say, it must be very hard to fill that void after retirement. So I can see how people like Jean would be drawn back into that sort of role after retirement.
Absolutely. And I want to point out that both of these people returned to jobs that they loved, but they both returned with reduced hours. And same was true with our two guests on the last episode that we talked to that had picked up part-time jobs. It connects to the study, like the study that you and I referred to earlier in this episode. No one is suggesting that working longer full-time at a crazy pace is going to be better for your health. What the study was recommending is that continuing to work, continuing to contribute, continuing to feel valuable and needed on a part-time basis is the sweet spot.
Right.
So it's that working part-time and not working full-time until you die, right? Which listeners are going to remember from episode 1 this season is the way it used to be. That's the way it was for humans for centuries. We worked until the day we died or became too sick to work and then died. And unfortunately, that is still true today for anyone who either lives in a country that doesn't have a state pension plan to support its older citizens. It's also true for those who haven't been able to save and invest in order to continue to,
Right.
to have some sort of an income in retirement that isn't a direct result of them being paid for their time and their effort by an employer.
Yep.
So we're going to explore those scenarios in a future episode, because I really found it quite eye-opening when I was doing some research. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole there. Yeah, we're going to talk about what state pensions look like around the globe.
Yeah, I think that'll be interesting, because we don't know whether we're well off here or there are other places where you could be better off.
Yeah, it's always interesting to know what what somebody else's reality is, because we kind of get cocooned in our own reality.
As I mentioned, Jean did have 7 months of full retirement before returning to work. So she got to experience the honeymoon phase, the holiday phase, whatever you want to call it, where you have fewer cares.
Yeah.
So we asked her, because she obviously is a hardworking individual.
Yeah.
What was that like for her?
Well, I read so much that I was actually like, okay, this is enough reading. I find that I'm a person that always has things on the go. So I was never really bored, but it was so missing that connection to the community. That really was hard for me. I thought about doing some volunteer work then, but when I looked at options, they just didn't have the variety that I was able to come back to with this particular job. But my husband loved it. He really wanted me to stay home. And so really some of it was convincing him that it was okay for me to go back to work. I didn't need to be retired, that I was pretty bored, and I wasn't bored, but I was bored,
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's so many factors that go into it. Work was willing to work with me to come back to less time. So, and to be a little more flexible with things.
So as you heard, like Jules in our last episode, and like me, Jean read a lot when she first retired, right? I really relate to that. She was never really bored, because she's one of those people, as you can hear, who always has things to do. She's always on the go, but she was missing that community that she'd been part of in her work. And a key here is that her employer was willing to work with her in terms of coming back to a reduced time schedule.
Yeah. So it was difficult to get that same perspective from Mark, because he never had that period of time yet.
Right.
I mean, he's still enjoying himself and has a lot more time to himself than he did, but he still has that work connection.
Yeah.
So not having been fully retired, we asked him about the mindset he had with respect to retirement and in respect to working. So a lot of times when we're talking with someone, Mark, that has retired and returned to work, we ask them questions like, how did it feel when you first retired? When did you decide to return to work? You've already filled in those blanks, and the first one's not applicable, and the second one was immediately. And I think that's an interesting choice to take. Like, I mean, obviously you've got the skills for the job and to go back to it. And I guess the question I'd have then is, it must be a totally different mindset coming back for part two, and as insofar as your enjoyment or what your perspective on the job and those sorts of things. That must be a different feeling when you've come back to be a constable.
Absolutely. And I mean, to answer the first part of the question, it actually does pertain. How did I feel? Because it's a big decision to step down, to go almost what you might consider backwards, although I don't. But a lot of people would look at it that way. A lot of people would look at it as stepping down. So facing that right at the start, it did feel, I was trepidatious. There's no question. I was a little bit scared to step back into the role of being a police officer. And that goes to the second part of your question. As a sergeant, your duties are completely different. You're handling evaluations, you're handling scheduling, you're handling discipline and that type of thing. Stepping back to a frontline constable is going back to something that's changed vastly since I first began and since I was a frontline constable.
Right.
So I had to relearn a lot of the skills that that you would think were automatic. Technology changed. The people I was dealing with on the road changed, and especially since COVID, there's a definite different feeling out there in the world, as I think we all know. So I had to, in a lot of ways, Dave, relearn what I sort of already knew,
Right.
if that makes any sense.
Oh, it does.
That's really interesting, Mark, because that wouldn't have occurred to me that that you would have had to do a lot of relearning because you were still in policing, but your role changed so significantly, right?
Absolutely.
What was your thinking about, I'd rather not just write off, I want to do this? If you could summarize that for us.
I can, and it was an interesting process because as I was approaching this, and I'm dealing with other officers who are, of course, looking 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road to their retirement, they were all saying, "You're crazy. You can retire? Just retire."
Yeah.
But again, like being a teacher, being a police officer is more of a calling or a lifestyle.
Yep.
So to think about absolutely cutting that off at one point and being a police officer one day and not a police officer the next, it has nothing to do with the authority. It has nothing to do with really the role as much as it has to do with how I felt about myself and what I wanted to accomplish still. So looking forward and planning that was it was a little bit hard because nobody really understood what I wanted to do. But again, it goes back to I wanted to get back to what I really joined the force for in the first place. And for some people in my profession, by the time they hit the 30 years, they're done. They
Right.
don't necessarily like the job anymore. They've gone through a tremendous amount, as have I. Some people handle it better than others. I don't think that I necessarily handled it better than others, but I didn't get jaded.
Right.
And I kept a love for what I do. So when I looked ahead to retiring, I was actually looking to almost rejoin the force.
Right.
I was looking to get back to what I loved.
Yeah.
And it was a very easy decision for me. It really was. Administration, like we all know, it's got different challenges, and they weren't challenges that I necessarily really wanted to keep going with. I wanted to go back to the challenges of a frontline officer.
And how long then have you been working as a constable part-time?
So I retired in May of 2021.
Okay.
So it's been 2 years plus.
Yeah.
And people ask me, how long am I going to do this? Because I am 62.
Yeah.
How long are you going to keep doing this? And my answer is always the same. I'm going to keep doing it as long as it's fun. When it stops being fun, when I stop making a difference, when I stop feeling like I'm actually being valuable, I'll quit. And I'll retire permanently. But up until then, and I'll retire to something else. But up until then, I'm going to keep going because I enjoy it.
So, Mark, you decided though that you were going to return part-time, and that intrigues me. So, tell me about your thought process on that, deciding to return to being a constable part-time as opposed to full-time.
Well, actually, that wasn't my decision. That's
Okay.
a decision of the Ontario government.
Okay.
So I had thought about doing all kinds of different things. One of the things I thought about doing was actually becoming a justice of the peace and seeing things from the other side.
A justice of the peace. Oh,
Yes.
cool.
But with the Ontario government, when you retire, you can only work a certain number of hours. And it's not really based on hours, it's based on how much money you can earn within a quarter. So I can only work a certain number of hours within each quarter before they start clawing back my pension, and I'm working for free. I do 2 10-hour days, and that leaves me a little bit of leeway in there that I can work an extra day here and there when the force needs me, when the OPP needs me.
Mark talked about being nervous, right? About returning to the road as a constable, because so much about the job had changed since he'd been in that role, not the least of which was tech.
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
Yep.
So he had so much to relearn. A lot of that he was able to turn to younger colleagues and ask them for their help. And I think that that's true for many professions. there's lots of learning as time goes on, and lots of learning if you're switching professions.
Yeah.
So again, I think that's a future episode, Dave,
Yeah.
where we examine the importance of staying open to learning as an older adult.
Well, and to be clear, that learning is traveling both ways in that relationship. If you have someone coming back like yourself, like if you're in a school and you're the acting principal and you've got a vice principal who's usually quite new to that role, again, you'd be able to teach them some things, and then you're going to see some things go, wow, we didn't do that then.
Exactly.
You had to bring your own wood for the fire and those sorts of things. So they don't still do that.
No.
I think in both cases here that returning to a job, especially a little bit tilted in favor of Mark, because he went back to an old role that turned out to have a lot of new aspects because he hadn't been there in quite a while. I think that's courageous, 100%. I haven't been in the classroom for a long time, and the thought of teaching today, if I had to go in tomorrow, that terrifies me. I don't know that I would last the entire day. I'd probably make an excuse, say I have a tummy ache, and go home. And Mark feels that his job as a police officer is a calling, and we often hear that for different fields such as healthcare, education, firefighters, whatever, that they feel that way. And I mean, clearly both Mark and Jean feel that strong pull back to their profession, at least while they feel they're able to contribute.
Yeah. I think that feeling of having something to contribute still is really key there. So
yeah.
Mark also talks about pension restrictions. He'd be happy to work more than 20 hours a week, but there would be financial penalties for him. And that is something that Ed referred to in the last episode, right? So in the research study that we've mentioned, the author called this policy disincentives. So those come from government, and they discourage, or the state, whatever, they discourage retirees from working beyond a certain age. And Mark's currently 62. He's having fun. He feels valuable. He feels he's making a difference. So he has no plans to retire fully anytime soon.
Right.
And in fact, he already knows that when he finally decides that he's ready to leave the OPP, he'll be retiring to something else as far as work goes. And he talked about that when we asked him what advice he had for older adults who are interested in continuing to work part-time.
So I started looking into art theft and cultural heritage protection. And I made the interest that I had in that, I turned it into a really exciting trip. I went and took a master's degree in Italy for 3 months and came back, wrote my dissertation over a year. And that was in the background. It was never anything that the OPP was really interested in, because until very, very recently, it hasn't been a hot topic here in North America. Now, the Toronto Police Service, interestingly enough, I just attended one of their first inaugural art theft conference a month ago. Now, I look back at that and I think to myself, okay, there's a skill that I gained a little bit through the OPP, but mainly on my own. And it's something that I haven't used over my career, but is it something I could do now? So I'm actually in the process of training in cultural property protection through a company over in England. And I'm going to be bringing over a museum security. I call it a museum security. It's a security program aimed at protecting cultural heritage. So it could be anything to do with antiquities, personal collections, museum collections, gallery collections, that type of thing. So I looked back at what skill I had, and I thought, how can I turn this into a new career? And in the future, when I'm tired of the frontline policing, or when the frontline policing is tired of me, I'm looking at that as an option. That's a way of saying, an example of saying, look at what you're passionate about, look at what you learned in the past that you might be able to transfer into the future. I think now, like I guess I was 10 years ahead of my time. I think if I was still a full-time constable, I could probably do something with it within the force, but that ship sailed, so I'll just grab another ship in the future.
Now, Mark, I happen to know that you've also written a book.
Yes.
So tell us how that came about.
Okay. I think probably about, oh God, I'm going to date myself here, 20 years ago, I read a book by John Grisham, and it was his first novel. And I read it and I thought, this is a good book, but I think I could do better. And in the back of my mind, I heard a voice say, you know something, put your money where your mouth is. So I started writing a book back then, 20 years ago, and it developed over years, and it was about AI. So again, I think I was ahead of my time.
Yeah.
And it's a detective novel set in Toronto. I finally published it in 2015, and it was selected for as a finalist for the Arthur Ellis Award for Best First Novel in Canada. It did not win. My wife was absolutely certain that it was going to, and I was absolutely certain it wasn't. So once again, I was right. But that falls into, again, what are you going to do in the future? What are you going to do when you do retire? I haven't had enough time to write the sequel. I've got it half done. I think it probably will be a good book, maybe a better book, but I still have to find the time to do it. You ask about advice for what to do when you retire.
Mm-hmm.
And in my opinion, what I think you have to do is you have to stay active. And active is very different than busy. Anybody can be busy, but to be purposely active is completely different. And I think you have to realize that when you first retire, you're going to have a whole list of things to do. And you're going to think, I'm busier now than I ever was. I can't keep up. This is going to last forever. But it doesn't. Because you go through the honey-do lists and you go through all these things that you wanted to accomplish. And all of a sudden you're looking around going, I'm done. Now what? And that's the busy side of things. The active side of things is actually figuring out what you like to do, what you're passionate about, and planning for that and making that happen. So I'm still looking for time to write. I haven't got there yet. I've still got the busy side of things. I've still got the part-time work, but that's something that I will definitely do. The other thing that I would think, I think it goes along with the staying active, is continually learning. I think that's incredibly important as you move into the next phase in your life. So for me, I study Italian every night. I don't know, I still can't speak it that well, but it's something that I do to keep my mind active. The other thing to do, as far as I'm concerned, is to stay physically active. So at the age of 61, after a 10-year hiatus, I went back to martial arts. And I never was flexible, but whatever flexibility I had, I lost over those 10 years. I started in about a year ago, a little over a year ago at Coburg Taekwondo, which is an amazing martial arts school here in Coburg, taught by Grandmaster Jonathan Field. And I thought to myself, what am I doing? This is crazy. I can't do this at 61, 62. But 2 weeks ago, I graded for my second black belt in something called the Superfoot Wallace system, which is a karate-based system. And if you've never heard of Superfoot Wallace, you should look into him, because he is, it's incredible. I was going to say he's the absolute example of retiring, but he's never retired. He's 78 years old. He was the full-time karate champion from 1974 to 1980. He fought with Chuck Norris. He taught Elvis Presley, and he is still at 78 the most active martial arts. He's a living legend. It's the physical sort of staying busy, staying active, and staying in shape that I really enjoy. And again, it goes back to learning something new, learning something beyond what I had before.
Those are all excellent pieces of advice, Mark. And I thank you for sharing those with us. Was there anything else that you wanted to tell us that maybe we didn't ask you about with respect to returning to work after retirement?
There is one other thing that I wanted to share, and I think this is really important, and it's about community. As you retire, it's very easy to isolate yourself. It's very easy to let life pass you by, watch TV, enjoy one too many glasses of wine, sit back on the social media side of things and all that type of thing that we're inundated with right now. I think it's very important to become part of community, and that community can be absolutely anything. So in my case, I have the community of a part-time job. Obviously, I've still got that community, and they're young, so they keep me young.
Yeah.
The martial arts side of thing is, again, my community. It's incredibly important to belong to a community, and that helps the longevity. That helps you stay active, it helps you stay busy, and it helps you stay connected to something. So it doesn't matter if it's a gardening community or a church community or bird watching community, it doesn't matter what it is, but you need to belong. And I think the final thing, and I was thinking about this last night, is the final thing I'd like to say and to pass on is don't let life pass you by. And I don't like the term aging gracefully. I think personally that you have to fight aging mentally and physically as if your life depends on it, because it does. And it's not that I don't want to get old. I do want to get old. I want to get very, very old. I just don't want to age. I think it's really, really important to fight that with everything you have. There's a song lyric out there that says, never slow down, never grow old. And it's sort of a mantra that I live by. And I think keeping busy, keeping connected to a community of some kind, and either finding your passion or returning to your passion is the key to a happy retirement or semi-retirement.
Mark spoke about taking a good look at your skills, passions, and what you've learned throughout your career and see what you have that can transfer to a part-time job. And that's so true that, you know, you shouldn't sell yourself short, that there's probably something that you can offer to a role as a mature adult. He also spoke about how he completed a master's degree in architecture in Italy, which sounds wonderful.
Sounds amazing.
Apart from that, having to study stuff. And he hopes to use that education along with his police background to get into cultural property protection in the future. And who'd have thought it? I bet that constable driving around many years ago didn't think that that's what that would come to, but he kind of held his eye on that prize. He's very interested in that. And he may be able to do that privately when who knows. And just to add, there are many college and adult education courses that you can take either for your own amusement, your own fulfillment, or as maybe I'd like to do a certain job, but I just need a little more, I need a refresher or some skill to do that. And they're often not too expensive as well. Mark has written a fiction novel. I don't know when he sleeps. That draws on his knowledge as a police officer. And we're going to give away a copy of that novel. And would you like to know how?
How are we going to do that?
We are going to do that through our socials again. The book is called Hard Drive. And to find out how to win your copy, check out the contest on our Instagram and Facebook pages. And any listener who's interested in purchasing the book after hearing from Mark, before the end of February, reach out to Mark at his email. And I'll do this, hopefully, if you've got a pencil, we'll put it on our website as well. But ARCA, so ARCA, ARCA Mark, all one word, 2013 at yahoo.ca. And if you reach out through Mark that way, he will sell you the novel at half price, 50% off.
I really related to what Mark was saying about the transferable skills. So for me, I really saw being in education as customer service, right? It was my customers, if you will, were the students, they were the parents. And for me, because I was the principal in the school, it was also all of the staff. And so I transferred that over to being a waitress. And that may sound crazy, but that is also customer service. And that was the piece that I was missing, right? It was through the pandemic and after being retired was being in service to others. And so that was definitely a transferable skill. And how about that 78-year-old karate champion that Mark mentions, Bill Superfoot Wallace? I checked out some of those videos on YouTube, and if you need inspiration for being physically active and knowing you have no limits, you've got to check that out. That's Bill Superfoot Wallace on YouTube. Like, amazing. Just incredible.
It is clearly
very inspirational.
Yeah. Well, also inspirational. Willie Nelson turned 90 recently. So
there we go.
Yeah. Mark also mentions staying active, not busy. He
Yeah.
made the difference between that, and that's very true. And that echoes Mike's advice. You may remember Mike on our season 2, episode 3.
Yep.
And just to focus on one last piece of advice that Mark threw in when we asked him that catch-all question at the end, when he referenced the lyric, "Never slow down, never grow old."
Mm-hmm.
And that sent you and I going, what song is that from?
Oh, I
And
know.
turns out that's Tom Petty's
Okay.
Mary Jane's Last Dance. And from the title, you may not remember, but if you Google that and listen to a bit of it, you'll go, oh, I remember that song.
Yep.
Now, sadly, Tom Petty passed away October 2nd, 2017, at the age of 66 from cardiac arrest.
Yeah.
However, 1 week earlier, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were performing at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. So Tom Petty grew old, but clearly he also, right, he didn't slow down. Oh, and Mark's last words for us, don't age gracefully.
Yeah.
It's fine to grow old, but not fine to age. You need to fight against that.
Yeah.
And we thank him for that advice.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, we also asked Jean what advice that she would have for anyone considering working in retirement. And most of what she had to say aligns with Mark's advice.
Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on about returning to work in retirement, or advice to others that are considering that we maybe haven't asked or you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, actually there is. Just because I see it in our seniors becoming more and more and more isolated. It's one of those things you don't realize it's even happening, I think, and it just gradually becomes more and more and more. They become more and more isolated, but don't even realize it because it's such a gradual thing. So I think staying connected with the community and doing everything you can is positive mentally, emotionally, and physically. And all three of those are so important. If people, for instance, spend more time sitting in front of the TV and they're not as active, then they're going to lose some of those physical abilities. We found it with COVID, when people are not socially connecting with other people, they become very isolated and lonely and depressed. And we saw the physical functioning of so many people just go downhill. And again, I don't think people realized it because it was such a gradual thing, being isolated in their homes, not getting out, doing all the things that they've previously been doing. So I think that people need to safeguard against letting those things dwindle away until they all of a sudden don't have the connections.
You were right, Mary Ellen. A lot of what Jean says mirrors what Mark had said to us. Staying physically active and connected to a community, whatever that community might be, that's going to be different for everybody, is good for your physical and mental well-being. And a part-time job, when you think about it, it's going to have those things. It's going to have a connection to people and a reason to move around and stay active and keep your brain active.
Yeah.
And, remember, a lot of community involvement costs you almost nothing.
Yeah.
A lot of communities you can get yourself involved in, whether it's a walking club or whatever it happens to be. And I was thinking, as we went through today's episode, we did talk a lot about the benefits of working, and there are some proven benefits to staying active like that. But we also know and appreciate that everyone's retirement is their own, and somebody out there has retired to stop working. They'd had enough of that. And I know, and Mary Ellen would agree, that that's okay.
Yeah.
That's you do, as my kids tell me all the time, you do you, Dad. But you do what makes you happy, and that's what's important.
Yeah.
And I want to remind listeners that, again, that you can get those previous episodes on our website and on your podcast platform, wherever you listen. But also future seasons will be found on our YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you'd like to see now what's there is some content there now. If you go to YouTube and just search for the Retirement Years Podcast, you'll find our channel there. And again, if you just click subscribe, that'd be great if you're logged in.
So I want to thank Mark and Jean, not only for being guests on our podcast, but for being such a contribution to their respective communities.
Yeah.
And I think, again, I'm going to tie back to the study that we talked about at the beginning of this episode. It concluded that older adults who work part-time not only live healthier, longer lives, they also contribute positively to the economy of their community, their region, and their country.
Yeah.
Right. So the implications for policymakers in high levels of government are to remove those disincentives to stop working at certain ages, because that then allows and really even encourages older adults who want to work part-time for as long as they feel able to, because it's going to be better for their health and better for the economy's health.
That makes sense, because if you've got a little extra money in your pocket, you're probably going to use it. And that's what makes your community go round.
That's right.
Well, that was fun looking at 4 individuals who we admired and had fun talking with and enjoyed their company. And Mary Ellen, I know you wanted to remind listeners again about something pretty special that's on our website.
In case you missed last week's exciting announcement, we now have the Retirement Years podcast merchandise for sale on our website. Whether you're looking to buy a gift for someone or treat yourself and show that you're a fan of our podcast, head on over to the retirementyearspodcast.com, select the store, and browse the variety of items created and produced by duckandsasseycreations.com. Thanks again for listening.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. On our next episode, we'll be speaking with a very dynamic and energetic man, somebody else that just makes me tired when he lists the things that he does and now does in retirement. His name's Fritz Gilbert, and we found Fritz through social media, and right away he agreed to speak with us, and that was great. Fritz and his wife entered into early retirement back in June 2018, the age of 55.
Yeah.
They've been sharing the lessons they've learned about making the most of one's retirement. So join us next week as Fritz describes how his blog, The Retirement Manifesto, will help you achieve a great retirement. So until next week, I'm Dave.
And I'm Mary Ellen.